So taking a look at the brief, what immediately strikes you as interesting about this exercise?
I think this exercise is really interesting because when you read it, there's no obvious right answer to it. So you've obviously got these 15 items, and all of them are useful in some way in the context of being stranded on a boat.
Yeah.
And so it's really unlikely that all 4 people are going to come up with exactly the same ranking. So there's definitely going to be an element of negotiation and discussion and disagreement. I think the other thing that's very interesting is there's actually not that much time. So you've only got 15 minutes for this particular exercise. So there's going to be an element of time pressure to get to that kind of outcome that everyone's agreed on. And
do you find that the time is often the kind of main source of pressure for people?
Yeah, I think when you're designing these kind of exercises, you want to add an element of pressure in there because you want to see how candidates might respond under pressure. There's always going to be a certain amount of content related to the time. So if it's a longer exercise, you're likely to be dealing with much more detailed content.
Yeah.
This is a relatively simple exercise in theory when you look at it, but actually there's quite a lot of discussion that needs to be had in a short space of time.
Yeah. So based on your experiences running exercises like this, how would you approach it? How would you start?
I think with this it's very easy to get drawn into very intricate kind of debates about items, whereas actually what you want to do is take a step back and try and contextualise it a little bit. So one approach might be to try and categorise the items. So you might have, these are food and drink, or these are kind of navigation, or these are signalling for help. That could be one approach. Another way to approach it would be to maybe split the items into 3 groups. So really critical, useful, not so useful, and then maybe try and debate amongst those 3 categories to try and simplify how the discussion might go, rather than what have you got as number 1, what have you got numbers 2, because in 10 minutes you're just not going to get through and you're not going to come to any conclusion.
That's a really nice idea. So your starting point is, okay, how can we sort these into categories that we can then springboard from?
Your starting point should be, how are we going to come to a decision about this? So how do we approach it as a whole? So should we look at a category? So which is the most important food item, or which is the most likely to help us give a distress signal? Or you could do it as, grouping everything together but putting it into really important, what's absolutely critical for us to have, what do we agree on are in our top 5?
Right, yeah.
Then maybe, and then you kind of agree the ranking. So trying to kind of cut it up into sections, I think, will really help get to a decision quicker.
Yeah, I can see that really, getting that kind of focus and consensus from the beginning and then building seems like a really good approach. So do you have any tips on how students should manage their time during the exercise?
I think that this exercise is really interesting because if you read the instructions, it says that they have up to 5 minutes individually to sort of look at it themselves, but it's not saying you have 5 minutes and then you move into the 10-minute discussion. So my advice on this one, based on the instructions, is to keep that individual bit as short as possible. So encourage people to do that very quickly to maximise the time they've got to discuss it. Because actually that's where the debate's going to come and that's where the time's going to really quickly run away. I think the other thing is someone needs to kind of really keep an eye on the time, and when you've got 2 minutes to go, they need to be kind of pushing the group to say, right, we've just got to make a decision on this, because otherwise there's going to be a flurry, or they're just not going to make a decision and then they failed the exercise basically.
Interesting. So would you almost sort of suggest that people nominate, like, could you be the kind of timekeeper?
I think it always helps to have someone, and often that's a role that's quite good to take on when you're in a group exercise. So say, okay, I'll keep an eye on the time, I'll let everyone know when we've got 2 minutes to go or 3 minutes to go, whatever.
So almost given that you're being assessed, it might be a good idea to volunteer that as a kind of role that you want to lead on.
Yeah, but don't get into a debate about who's going to be the timekeeper.
Yeah. So in all your experience running assessment centres, have you seen some common mistakes, in particularly in exercises like this, have you seen common mistakes cropping up, and how do you recommend people avoid them?
I think the fundamental thing to remember is that this is a group exercise, and the group is the thing that an assessor is looking for. So what they're really looking for is, how are you interacting with other people? So how are you communicating your point of view, and how are you responding to others' point of view? It's not about how do you get your way at the expense of everyone else that's in the exercise. So I think where people often go wrong in group exercises is trying to get their view through at the expense of everyone else. So either they're not listening to other people in the group and being willing to kind of, I suppose, compromise or change their view, or they start interrupting or being kind of slightly aggressive, or on the flip side of that, they don't say anything at all. So often what you see is, you know, someone completely dominates the group. That's not necessarily the person that gets hired, but also the person that will absolutely not get hired is the person that says, says nothing. They're quiet. They don't kind of interact with the group at all.
Yeah, so it's almost like you've got to. That's the kind of, it's one of those skills is judging how you can contribute in a group that is balanced between those two extremes.
It's got to be constructive. It's got to be about, okay, look, I hear what you're saying. The reason I think that this item is more important is because A, B, C.
Yeah.
So being able to kind of negotiate that point of view in a way that's that you would expect in a business environment, a work environment. We don't go around work kind of shouting at people or kind of interrupting them. Hopefully, otherwise, please don't go and work for that.
So is a student at a disadvantage if they don't know much about the topic? So in this case, it's all about survival and sort of nautical know-how. Is that going to put them at a disadvantage if they don't know much about that sort of stuff?
I would say that most exercises are designed to not require any background knowledge. So it's really looking at how do you take the information you have and make a decision on it. That said, if someone in the group does have some experience, that can be helpful sometimes. So use that as a way to help the group. But the risk is that someone who appears to have more knowledge can take the group down a particular course of action that might not necessarily be the right one.
That's interesting. So almost like having too much prior knowledge could be it's almost something to be aware of as much as having not much knowledge on the topic. It's how do I apply it in the context of this task?
Yes, and make sure it is relevant to the task. So, to give an example, in this case, someone who's got nautical knowledge might steer the group down a course that says, well, this is how we would navigate our way back to shore. But actually, if you read the exercise, it's all about how you present your ideas to the Coast Guard. I mean, this is a rescue mission. This is not a kind of how do we get back to shore. You're in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The chances of you actually being able to sail, there's no paddles. There's no you're not going to row your way to shore. So this is about how do you stay alive and get rescued.
So is there anything else you'd like to tell students about this exercise?
Well, I think there's a couple of hidden clues in this exercise to help the students that they might not necessarily pick up on. The first one is that their scores are going to be ranked against the Coast Guard's view, and they're there to present their ideas to the Coast Guard, which to me suggests that this is much more about a rescue mission rather than navigating themselves to the shore. The other clue is that in addition to the 15 items, they've got a box of matches. So that suggests there's something important about those matches. So what have they got in that collection of items that you might use matches for, and is that important? So how might they use the matches? So
is that sometimes a common theme in assessment centre exercises like this? There's sometimes a kind of an interesting angle you could take if you can spot it.
I think that it's really important to read everything thoroughly and make sure that you're clear. So either there will be some kind of hidden clues. Sometimes there might be some red herrings in a group exercise. The other thing that might happen is new information might come in midway through an exercise. So being kind of making sure you read things carefully, respond to changes in circumstance potentially. And not getting swayed by some things that might take you down the wrong course of action is a really important skill.
So it's sort of coming into the experience with an eye for really engaging with the kind of process of doing the task well, rather than getting too caught up in particular details.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So are most group exercises like this one, or are there like different types that you can find?
Generally, there's a couple of methodologies for group exercises. One is that the candidates are given a group of options, and they have to decide which one they want to go for. So a little bit like this, where they're coming up with a list of recommendations. So they might find themselves in a situation where, you know, they're appointed as a group of students to review 5 different options for the company, and they need to discuss them and decide which one they're going to recommend to senior management, and then they kind of they do that recommendation. The other option is where they're given something that they are representing. So to flip that same scenario, each of them is representing the 5 different options, and they have to argue their case. So you might see that more in a kind of maybe a law firm, or where there might be an element of sales or persuasion needed, where in that scenario the company is looking to see much more of their kind of negotiation and assertiveness skills, versus more of a collaborative exercise where they're trying to kind of discuss it together. But generally it's one of those two. There's normally some element of presentation at the end. That could be more formal, where they have to kind of prepare something a bit more lengthy, or it could be that they just have to come to an outcome. But this is, this exercise is quite typical of what you might see, albeit that it's shorter. So I would say a typical group exercise is more likely to be 30 to 45 minutes, where they kind of have a bit longer for that discussion and presentation element.
Right, so be prepared for a lengthy group exercise, and before you attend the assessment centre, think about what are the kind of core skills that this role that I'm going for requires.
Yeah.
Because they'll probably be tested in that.
Absolutely.